I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and we have a very, very cool book to talk about today. Feeding Ghosts is Tessa Hulls' first memoir. It's also a graphic. I keep wanting to say it's a graphic novel, but it's a graphic memoir. It's your first book. You taught yourself how to write comics, but also more importantly, you were a DJ in Antarctica. And I swear all of this is going to make sense, but Tessa, it's really good to see you. I need you to explain the DJ in Antarctica part.
Yes. Oh, thank you so much, Miwa, for having me on the show and also having that be the starting point, because I feel like the through line, both in who I am as a maker and in Feeding Ghosts, is really unexpected trajectories where I say, wait for it, I promise this is going to make sense. Basically, I ran away from my family's trauma by going to the most extreme frontiers that I could find. And I ended up in Antarctica by way of accidentally becoming a chef through playing college rugby. It'll all make sense, just read the book. But basically, remote frontier communities are some of the most creative places you will ever be. And I was down there at McMurdo Station, the science research station, and I was a volunteer DJ. So I had a 2-hour show every Sunday called Poor Life Decisions on ICE 104.5. The logo is a penguin in front of a radio tower. Yeah. And so the reason there's this radio community down there is because there used to be special vinyl collections that were just for play on military bases. And so there was this broom closet down there that had 20,000 unmarked records. They didn't have any art on them because they were specifically for armed forces TV and radio. And you could just go vinyl diving. And the rumor is that as vinyl became obsolete, all the other collections were destroyed. But because of the bureaucracy of needing to do that in a specific, very bureaucratic way, the Antarctic collection survived the call. So once I learned that that was a possibility, I pretty much just lived in that vinyl room and fell in love with 1940s high lonesome cowboy ballads, which also is integral to Feeding Ghosts.
Yeah, because you wanted to be a cowboy. And as a kid growing up in Massachusetts, I would have thought that was the coolest thing in the world. I still actually kind of have a cowboy thing, but now we know so much more about the mythology of the American West. And mythology is a big part of what you're writing about, only it's family mythology. And your mom and your grandma had a complicated relationship. You had a complicated relationship with both of them. And you're writing about mothers and daughters in escape and being Asian American and what that means. And we're going to bounce back and forth, I can guarantee you, between the phrase Asian American and Chinese American. I happen to be a couple of different kinds of Asian mixed together. So I use Asian American for myself. It's easier. I'm part Taiwanese and part Japanese. You're part Chinese. And our Chinese doesn't quite overlap. So,
well, I mean, there's political contention for sure.
Yes.
With you being, if we wanted to even just base this conversation around the complex microcosm of you being Japanese Taiwanese and like me being the result of a family that fled to Hong Kong after the communist takeover, like we sure do have some history we could go into.
Colonialism comes in many, many, many varieties. That's the fastest way to describe that. But I want to go back to the start of your book because you taught yourself how to draw comics. And there's actually a piece while you're in Antarctica where you're hiding under the bed because you share quarters with 3 other people and you can't have the lights on. So you're working literally, you've almost made the equivalent of a dark room, only it's a light room under your bed. You're learning how to draw comics. You're figuring out how to tell a story that's multi-generational, crosses continents, ocean, all of this stuff. How did you know it had to be told graphically?
Well, I knew immediately that there was no other way I could pull off the scale of what I was trying to do. And my background is it's kind of equal parts visual art and writing. But before I started becoming a compulsive genre hopper, as I call it, I was mostly a painter. That was kind of my most polished medium. And so, you know, I made paintings, I framed them, I hung them in galleries, and it was not an existential question when someone asked me what I did for a living. But I've also done a lot of stuff around working with archives, performance art, really just for me, each project dictates the medium that I work in. And the idea of just doing one thing is like, oh, a horrible static cage. And so essentially coming in as a background as a painter and an essayist, I think eventually I was going to have to do something that fuses those forms. And the reason I knew that Feeding Ghosts had to be a graphic novel is because I wanted to work with 6 different timelines. So there's basically China past, China present, Hong Kong past, Hong Kong present, family past, family present. And the way that I structured the book is there's 11 different chapters, and each chapter contains all 6 of those timelines. And you just can't do that kind of jump in narrative structure unless you also have the ability to use images. And so I essentially knew that in order to basically fuck with the reader and take them through these like really jarring jumps to show how history is related, the only way that I could make that make sense was to be in there as a narrator, like literally in my studio, lugging the reader along with me as they were traversing this story. And also, I cover about 100 years of Chinese history in this book. And if I had done that in writing, it would have just been dry and academic, and there was no way to get around it.
It also would have been about 800 pages.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you hit everything.
Well, I tried, but there were definitely parts where I would have loved to go into more detail. But it's a choice where either I could add 3 panels or another 30 pages. And so things like the intricacies of, well, what does it mean for Hong Kong to be a special administrative reason? And a lot of the contemporary history of Hong Kong, in a perfect world, I would have loved to dive into that. But unfortunately, so many of the themes of this book around revisionist history, the control of the present through language, censorship, have become so much more pertinent, especially as it pertains to Hong Kong.
I mean, Hong Kong's unrecognizable at this point. I mean,
Yeah.
it was a British colony for so long, but then after the handover in 97, there was this moment where Hong Kong was Hong Kong, right? It was like an independent country. It was its own, and it was taking from the East and the West, and wherever it felt like it was, and it's been a really long time, obviously, since I've been there, but it had this moment where it was just allowed to be itself. And then obviously in the last few years, that has changed radically. And when I think about your mom's experience, so your mother and your grandmother leave mainland China. Things are not good under Mao for them. You hit the major points for me. You're talking about the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution and all of these sort of moments that I think not everyone's familiar with, but you really kind of do need to know if you're going to understand China as it is now. And of course, the Opium Wars, whatever. And Opium War seems to be a point that people can gravitate towards, but I'm like, yeah, there's stuff that happened more recently. But thinking about your mom and your grandma leaving, ending up in Hong Kong, right? And you and I are going to stay away from some of the details because we want people to meet your mom and your grandma as you present them, right? But that shift is huge. Like, they're leaving in the middle of the night. They're showing up in a place that they have no connection to. It's this constant sort of outsider status, right? But if I'm remembering this correctly, you didn't really speak Chinese when you started this project. Like, you got to a place where you could at least do some of the research, but you're trying to reconstruct parts of your family's history, parts of the cultural history, and luckily your grandmother had written a book.
Yeah.
Can we start with your grandmother's book?
We can start with my grandmother's book. So essentially, she was a journalist working in Shanghai during the communist takeover. And for a variety of reasons, both courageous and stupid, she didn't leave when everyone else who had sort of the foresight to understand the writing on the wall was getting out. And so she ended up on the wrong side of history and found herself in the position of being a single mother raising a mixed race bastard child because my mom was the result of my grandma getting knocked up and abandoned by a Swiss diplomat. And, she would be arrested, held for days at a time, disappeared, and forced to write confessions over and over again until her mind eventually cracked. And she eventually was able to get herself and my mother out of China beneath the false bottom of a fishing boat just before the Great Leap Forward. And once my grandma got there, it's like all of that pent up fear and anxiety and anger just came pouring out in the form of a memoir. And she just wrote frantically for 3 months and wrote a book titled 8 Years in Red Shanghai: Love, Starvation, Persecution. And because of the bamboo curtain, there was no news coming out of the mainland. So there was this immediate audience just hungry for a firsthand account of what was actually happening there. So it goes without saying it was a banned book in China. It was published by a Taiwanese press. And so at first, my grandma thought that this was her ship coming in, and everyone was telling her she's going to be famous, she's going to have no financial trouble for the rest of her life. And then the book was pirated and she wasn't really paid. And so she ended up with basically enough of a windfall to put my mom into an elite colonial boarding school for 1 year. And then she had a mental breakdown and was institutionalized in Castle Peak, which was Hong Kong's first mental institution. So it's a complicated story because my mom was effectively raised as an orphan by a colonial boarding school. And because of the stigma about mental illness, she didn't tell anyone about her situation with her mom. And so she would sneak out on the weekends to go secretly visit her mother in Castle Peak. So it's complicated because, on the one hand, my mom was being raised amidst these very, very wealthy upper echelons of Hong Kong society, where she was being trained by British expat teachers in High Queen's English as though she belonged to the social class of the elite, even though she was a charity case and had nothing herself. But I think that's maybe one of the through lines of this book is, if you think that there are any easy answers, I have done my best to leave you nothing that will not cause you to question your preordained assumptions.
Yeah, we need more of that. Straight up, we need more of that. But I felt for your mom quite a lot as a kid. I cannot imagine how complicated and difficult, and even, in the context of Hong Kong, like she's losing her language, right? Like she's being taught the Queen's English, and that's just a different experience of the world. Never mind like the whole POV, what does the world look like and who's running the world and all of that, but even simple stuff like language and food and ritual and cultural markers, right? Like she's got
Yeah.
to deny her own mom exists.
Well, and it's funny because the microcosm of that showed up even in what I ate as a child, where it would be like stir fry, stir fry, stir fry, stir fry, stir fry, corned beef and cabbage, you know? And so you could see these marker points of the way in which here you have these like ethnically Chinese students who are also being groomed for a life in which the colonialism of Hong Kong will continue forever and they will marry white men. And it's just such a fascinating paradox that I really didn't understand about my mother, who, I should mention, my father is British, like never became a US citizen, thick British accent, British. And I did not understand that essentially that was the closest my mother could have come to marrying within her own culture once she came to the US.
I mean, to be a halfie in Hong Kong is totally different from being a halfie here, right? Like mixed race, however you want to refer to it. I use halfie as shorthand just because that's what I use. But it's an entirely different caste. And I mean cast with an E, like Isabel Wilkerson cast is sort of, you move in the world in a different way. So when your mom gets to the States, her arrival here, she's here to go to college. She has many, many adventures. We're not going to go. Your mom did some stuff.
I'm glad. I'm so glad she had that brief chapter in her life of
right?
making questionable, wild decisions.
I think everyone should be able to have that moment, but that's me. Her proximity to whiteness in Hong Kong sort of is part of her approach to her experience here. She ends up in places that are not necessarily where you might think a Chinese immigrant would end up, right? Like, so there's the Minnesota thing and then Northern California, but not, again, not San Francisco, not Oakland. Like, you guys were in a tiny, tiny town, right?
Yeah, a town of 350. And I think that's the thing is, my mom's childhood held such a heartbreaking, almost pathological amount of isolation that I think it just really never occurred to her that community was something that people might need. And she was always a hermit. And so I think, she ended up on the West Coast because at that point she was channeling a lot of her unprocessed pain into religion hopping. There was a church out there. That's what brought
Yeah.
her out there. And she's still in that town of 350.
What's that like when you go back to visit? Because you obviously have not lived in that community in a really long time.
Well, there's a lot of access to the natural world there, and sometimes I go running twice a day.
Wait, is that when you started doing the long distance bike rides? Like you wrote a piece about riding from California to a couple of weddings on the East Coast. I think one was Mid-Atlantic and one was Massachusetts. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was really curious about the American South because
Okay.
growing up on the West Coast. I think like having immigrant parents and being somebody who has an unusual amount of restlessness, call that a trauma response, if you will. I really just felt like I wanted to see for myself what these unknown parts of the map of my own country were. And so I figured the best way to do that was by crossing it at about 12 miles an hour. So yeah, I hopped on my bike in Southern California and I had to be at a friend's wedding in Austin, Texas. And then a couple months later, a cousin's wedding in, oh gosh, somewhere in Massachusetts. Yeah, so I just biked from Southern California to Maine and then dropped back down along the coast to my cousin's wedding.
It's not necessarily what your mother might have planned for you. Keeping you safe is a really big thing for your mom. And it's actually the source of a lot of conflict between the two of you, starting when you're quite young. And again, I have so much sympathy for your mom because how would she possibly know? She was not really parented herself. So how would she know how to parent children? And you have a brother. And I feel like, I mean, you and I are meeting for the first time, obviously, as we record this, but I feel like you put everything. And I say this as a person with an immigrant parent, and as we all know, sometimes it's harder to get stuff out of immigrant parents than it is to get them out of. Stories are not easily forthcoming from some of our parents. But you made a really conscious decision to say, hey, that stops here. And I am going to say all of the things that need to be said. And I'm wondering how that felt for you as you were doing it, because obviously, you're still in contact with your mom. Your grandmother has passed at this point, but it's a lot.
Yeah. Well, in everything that I do, I think I just take the path of transparency because that way there's no artifice to it. There's no trying to keep track of what you can and can't say. And so I really wrote my ethical quandaries into the book in places where I was having to try and convey some notion of an objective truth when I was working with conflicting information or didn't have access to what I would need for those answers. I just let the reader in on it. And so in that way, I think that's how I got around the thorny question of the ethics involved. And my mom actually was really on board with this project because I really started it in the spirit of how can I heal my relationship with my mother. And I think that's where my background of not being somebody who was an author or ever had any aspirations of being an author, in my mind, I was chasing one question, which was what broke my family? And to answer that question, I needed a decade and it took the form of a graphic novel. But my interest as an artist is maybe different because I'm not that concerned with the final product. For me, I'm process over product all the way. And so I think because of that, I was able to really show up with a truly blank notebook and allow the story to kind of be as feral and wild and wandering as it wanted because I think of myself as a conduit rather than a focus. And I knew that I had grown up with this maelstrom of untold stories and unprocessed ghosts. And I sort of thought about them as, like when an oyster has a piece of sand that becomes a pearl, that's what this swarm of ghosts was in my family, except it was like a much darker, less aesthetically pleasing morass. And so I just had this image of myself needing to wade into the thick of it with a blank notebook to sit with these terrifying swarming beasts until I could see the humanity that first formed them.
Yeah, and ghosts are something that cut across Asian mythology, folklore, whatever you want to call it, right? There's some similarities. I'm just going to use Japan and mainland China for a second, but this concept of a hungry ghost, right? Like an unsettled hungry ghost that is not, shall we say, moving on to the next thing, whatever that may be, right? That is absolutely a trope that shows up in both places. And I believe the Koreans have also similar, like, it's just a thing. So when I saw the title, Feeding Ghosts, that got my attention very, very quickly because that is the last thing that any of our elders would want to do, right? Like, they kind of want to feed them to make them go away, sure, but like, you don't really want to engage with them. You just want to keep them. And I was like, okay, what is this woman going to do? Like, where are we going with this? I loved the structure, the way you were doing past and present. And, you've got to start with China. You've got to start with Mao. You've got to start with all of the things that happened. Because a lot of that history, right, is Mao saying, oh, that thing you think just happened didn't happen. And then all of the people behind him would be like, oh yeah, super, that super did not happen. Like, we made everything, we fed everyone, we took care of it. No. Right. And then we get the Cultural Revolution in response, which is like, we're going to give the kids the keys and it's not going to go well, but we're going to then pretend it didn't happen. Like, and I don't mean to sound flip about all of this, but it is that kind of level of gaslighting, of pretend, like straight up. It's like watching kids say, I'm going to put my hands up in front of my face and you can't see me. And it's like, but this is the historical record. So the idea that this is where your grandma comes from and your mother, and then we get to Hong Kong, which is, and then we meet you. And you want to be a cowboy and you want to blow it all up and you want people to talk about this and you want to know what's going on. I mean, that line is a trip and it all comes back to ghosts.
It does. Yeah. I think that denial can metastasize. And that's what happened both in mainland China and within my family. And that's kind of the structure that I adhere to is, look, the only way I can tell you what happened in my family is to show you what was concurrently happening within mainland China. And looping back to the question of why a graphic novel, the way that I chose to show that was by drawing a set of Russian nesting dolls. So getting, the giant wooden Mao with the tiny wooden grandma inside of it to be like, look, these are both completely distinct and fundamentally entwined. And let me show you how. I do think there's some truth to the fact that, gosh, what's that saying? The first generation survives, the second assimilates, and the third remembers. And I think there's something to this idea that when the first immigrants come over, they're just trying to keep their heads above water. They're trying to navigate this unfamiliar territory, and by the time the privileged Americans, the ones born in this country, show up, we've really been gifted the ability to have a different scale of dreams. And I think our parents then become confused by our fascination with the past because for them it's something that they experienced, whereas for us it's this negative space where something that we didn't have access to nonetheless dominated the family structures in which we grew up. And so I would have loved to be able to tell this story without having to start with a timeline going back to like the 1840s, but to really go back to the beginning and say, well, what caused this? What caused the flow of life and light within my family to go out? That was just where it started. And showing up with a blank notebook, I just sat it out and tried to do my job.
Well, there was a show, you did an installation, what, in 2017 up in Santa Cruz?
2019.
2019. Okay. Did that installation feed the work you were doing, or is the work feeding the installation? I mean, because I can see, having looked at some of the photos from that piece, I can see sort of the connection to some of the work that appears in Feeding Ghosts.
Yeah, they're fundamentally entwined. So the way that show came about, it was a solo museum show at the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History, and it was called Guided by Ghosts. Initially, the curator there just wanted me to show in progress pages from this graphic novel. And so I went down there to meet with the curatorial team. And by sheer coincidence, the artist that had installed in the gallery before had put infinity corners into the square room. So it was one contiguous space. And they were going to take those out. And I was like, wait, no, leave those in. Because I started talking to their archivist, and she just offhandedly mentioned, like, oh, yeah, Santa Cruz used to have all these Chinatowns, but they were destroyed. And the last one washed away in a flood. And it's across the street from our museum. And then the museum owns the Chinese American cemetery. And I was like, hold up, wait. And to their credit, the museum let me entirely hijack the direction of that show. And so I ended up doing a deep dive starting in the 1500s with the Manila Galleon trade routes that were bringing the first Asians to the west coast of America, which is of course tied to like the Philippines. And it's all so entwined. And I turned the gallery into basically a shrine to Chinese American history in the Monterey Bay region starting in the 1500s. And so when eventually we got to 1927, which is both the Chinese Civil War and the year my grandmother was born, that's when I started bringing in my own family's story. So the show did eventually get to a wall where it showed in progress pages. I jokingly told the museum that we should just build a replica of my studio and I would bring all my reference books. And then they said, sure. And we did that. So readers could basically go on this long walk through history. I made a series of paintings for each of these really kind of salient things that happen. so that you were looking at the primary documents, you were looking at historical photographs, and then really detailed gouache paintings, kind of taking a more artistic interpretation. So that's kind of where my career got to, was everything everywhere all at once, which I am like obviously directly also referencing that movie, because I think that is the closest creative corollary to what I
Mm-hmm.
tried to do in this book, where if you try and explain it just on the level of what's in it, it sounds absolutely incoherent and you think it couldn't possibly make sense. But then by the end of it, you realize that these things that feel like throwaways are actually meticulously crafted points of emotional resonance that just required a lot of scaffolding to understand where they were going.
And it's so much a part of you. And there's a period in the book, though, it seems like it's your sort of early adolescence, late childhood, where you're trying to figure out what it means to be a halfie. You've got classmates who are teasing you and saying, well, of course you're Chinese. And you're kind of like, well, I don't really look Chinese. I don't speak Chinese, because your mother made a point of not teaching you and your brother to speak Chinese. And so you are this outsider kid, but you don't have a clear grasp, or you're trying to figure out what it means to be Chinese American. When did that shift for you? Because obviously that is not the case anymore. And I felt for tiny Tessa. It bummed me out for you, because that is not a fun experience at all. But when did it shift?
Well, I think for me, that's why I became a cowboy, is when you're given a set of binary options and you're like, well,
Mm-hmm.
neither of these fit. You just take the non-committal other. And I think in some ways I chose that for myself, because I sort of understood that on a bunch of different levels, not just in terms of ethnic or cultural identity, but sort of always being a polymath who's really interested in the underlying structures and patterns more so than any one particular thing. I think I'm a chameleon by nature. And to me, I've always thought about my way of moving through the world is, if we're all a connect the dots puzzle, most people are fixed points. And I am the through line that connects them. Like, I'm the one being like, okay, I can't stay here, but I'm going to show you all the rocket ship. And so on the one hand, yes, I think I had a very lonely childhood for a lot of different reasons. But at the same time, I'm so deeply grateful for the fact that I am so comfortable being alone in a way that I think is the greatest privilege of my life. If it's just me alone in the woods, I am beyond happy. And I should say, part of the reason this book ended up what it did is because I wrote it while doing this thing called the Penn Northwest Marjorie Davis Boyden Wilderness Writing Residency, where basically one writer a year for over 30 years just gets given an off-grid cabin in the middle of the wilderness in Southern Oregon, and you are left alone with no cell service, no continuous electricity, and you do whatever you want with that time. So that was where I found the structure of this book. So in a way, I wouldn't say that it's that I became comfortable with saying, I am a mixed race Chinese American woman. And I actually, I like to play chess, but I like to be Black. I like to respond. I think there's a way, and that's always the role that I take in any circumstance. Is I'm just kind of sitting back with my invisible bowl of popcorn and seeing how other people are choosing to categorize me. And again, not just with race, but like artist, writer, I'm like chef. There's a lot of things that I do, bike mechanic. And I really think I get a lot of data by never being the one to define myself. So in a way, my comfort came not from choosing a static identity, but from really leaning into this idea that I am a creature of constant dynamism.
I also think that collecting data reference that you just made, I mean, it makes me smile, because I'm like, yeah, that's what artists do. Like, it doesn't matter what the medium is, right? Like, you're collecting information and then turning it into a thing to interpret whatever that moment is. And in your case, it could be gouache, it could be black and white pencil, it could be, I will say, like, making notes as I'm going through these gorgeous, heavily illustrated pages, I had to resort to colored pencil. And because, I mean, usually I'm making notes in a galley with just a standard #2 Ticonderoga pencil. I happen to like pencil. And yeah, that doesn't work in this context. I was like, I know I have a box of colored pencils somewhere. And thinking about the text in a different way, thinking about how you were pulling together all of these, for some people, very disparate pieces. I mean, I got very happy when you were talking about cowboys. I was like, all right, okay, who are you? Who are you, Tessa Hulls? And certainly I have a much better idea now that I've read the book. But was there ever a moment where you thought, oh, why am I doing this?
Oh God, every moment for many, many years. I mean, I think for me, it was less a question of why, because there was never an element of choice in this. It was the story that I spent my entire adult life running from. And I think when my grandma passed away in 2012, and it really showed me that I had misunderstood the narrative of my family because, my mom spent her entire life from basically the age of 10 onwards caring for her mother. And when that burden was removed, my mom did not find any more freedom. Nothing shifted. And that I think is the moment at which I knew I was going to have to write this book. So that was in 2012. I started in 2015. So it took me a couple more years of running from it to really start, but it really made me understand that the stories that we cling to actually become the cages that define us. And eventually I was going to have to touch this. But so I think in a way it both made this process more agonizing, but also more liberating to have never wanted to do it because my ghost literally hijacked the landscape and told me that I had to. And then I spent a decade on that. And actually just looping back to a point that you made earlier about artists as data collectors and mentioning gouache and pencil and whatever else, I think for me, that element of data collection is often much, much weirder. And it's like,
Oh, okay.
so to tell you an example, one of my favorite projects I ever did is when I got back from Antarctica, I had just been like on a bender of adventure and creativity, and I knew that I needed a fallow season. So I came back to Seattle and decided I was going to deliberately not make, and I was not just going to let myself run on fumes and momentum. And so for 6 months, I started picking up every hair tie I found in the street, and I didn't know why I was doing it. And I did this, and it would grow and grow and grow, and other people started to know I was doing this, and I would just put them in a chain and loop them together. And eventually, I probably had, I don't know, like 50 feet of linked hair ties. And I ended up giving a talk called What We Make When We're Not Making, an exploration of downtime in the creative process as explored by hair ties. And it touched on like, female science fiction authors, Wile E. Coyote, glacial moraines, like, and that to me was the moment at which I realized that how I work as a maker is through accretion and being willing to sit in that period of data collecting for perhaps a length of time that is unusual. And so I think for me, I've always been durational in how I work. And I was just doing another interview where somebody was pointing out that difference where artists tend to have this segment of work where they're doing things that are just like on an unreasonable scale because they're interested in time or in how layers develop. And I hadn't thought about it in those terms, but I think that's where I feel much more like a multidisciplinary artist who happened to make a book because I have been so interested in basically, well, what if I were to do this, but at like 30 times a reasonable scale, which is why this book ended up what it did.
I like the scale of this book, though. I think, I mean, especially when we're talking about Asian women, right? Like, occasionally we get written out of the story, right? Like, it happens. But I love the fact that it's centered on your grandmother and your mother, and the fact that you're not saying it's okay for these secrets to continue. I feel like I was pushed to think in new ways. And
Oh, good.
I still have family in Asia too. So like I do that thing, right? Like when summers, there were very weird summers where I'm like, what is going on? Where am I? And now I have a very different relationship with the place. But, it is that kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out. And intellectually, I knew a lot of the history that you were talking about. And the personal stuff, I was just kind of fascinated that you were willing to really, really get into the details of the stuff. I really am looking forward to readers getting their hands on this book because I think it's really surprising in a lot of ways. It's really special, this book. It's really different. It's really special, and it's not just the macro and the micro. It's the way you, well, twin everything together. I mean, you've given your grandmother this sort of extra piece. You've given your mom this extra piece. Has your mom read this book?
That is a complicated question.
Okay.
So I worked very closely with my mother on this. And so, as part of this, we went on research trips to China and Hong Kong together. I met my family for the first time with her translating. The thing with my mother, which you will learn in reading this book, that she is a complicated character. I know she has a tendency to take information and project a reality without being able to take the full context into account. And so I showed her a lot of stretches that were pretty carefully mediated on my end so that I knew that it wouldn't be something that would require the broader context of the whole structure for her to be able to hold. But things took an even more complicated and, like, frankly heartbreaking turn where my mom has dementia. And
Oh,
for
I'm sorry.
well, it's okay because I think talking about this, it's a huge part of the story, and the idea of recurrence and patterns, the painful irony of the fact that, my mom's dementia kinda went from a steady decline to off a cliff about 6 months ago. So she is becoming my grandmother in front of my eyes and fading, from her ability to follow her own story just as this is going out in the world. And so I haven't talked about this publicly, but there's something that my mom is doing right now that I think is an amazing portrayal of tenderness on a lot of different people's parts, where she's not at a cognitive place where she can read a book anymore. And so a dear friend of hers is reading the whole thing out loud to her and helping her understand. Because I told my mom, I said, I have all these reservations. You're going to see pictures of yourself. You're not going to be able to understand the words. And I think leaving you alone with this in this state would be disastrous for all parties. And so we were able to arrive at this really kind of beautiful collective compromise where yeah, my mom's friend is reading the book with her right now.
That feels really amazing. That feels like you get to build a new thing, right? Like you built this book, you built this sort of mechanism for storytelling, right? Like, yes, graphic forms are not new when it comes to memoir, but the way you do it feels very new and very fresh to me. Yeah, I'm going to be thinking about this for a really long time. Like, I am absolutely going to be thinking about this memoir for a really, really long time. You, however, were telling me something before we started taping about what you're currently doing. And I'm going to ask you to talk about it a little bit because one, I think it's a really cool project. But again, like you're just pulling from so many different places. I guess it is best to call you a maker, huh? I know you've been self-referencing as a maker, and now I'm like, okay, I kept calling you an artist and a writer, but yeah, it is bigger than that. And when people hear what you've been up to, yeah, it's going to make a ton of sense. But I think it's really cool.
Yeah, I mean, me too, me too. I'm kind of going rogue because, obviously right now the etiquette of publishing and book launch, I should have cleared my schedule to do anything that would garner any amount of attention for this book. And I hate this game with, like, the fiery passion of 10,000 dying suns. And I'm sort of breaking etiquette a bit by just talking honestly about it. And I think for me it's because what I love is being deeply, deeply out in the world and then making work in response to that. And so for me, the process of turning inwards and making a memoir for 10 years, it felt like strip mining myself and it felt like betraying the core of why I make. So I decided to prioritize joy and actually getting my life back to something that I want to live. And so the 2 weeks prior to this, I was working as a mentor for an organization called Sawhorse Revolution here in Seattle, and I'm making sure to mention their name because they're amazing, and you should all look them up. And so basically, they teach high school students construction skills by having them build infrastructure for other local nonprofits. So I spent the 2 weeks before this teaching a bunch of teenagers how to use nail guns by building an outdoor kitchen for an urban farm. And right now I'm doing this from a borrowed office at an organization called Coyote Central. And that's an organization that teaches art classes, but I'm on their roster as a culinary teaching artist. So right now, my students, who range from 10 to 14, are making cinnamon rolls while I duck out to do this. So that's how I'm spending the remaining 2 weeks before my book comes out. I think my publisher probably thinks I've lost my mind.
Okay, so you as a maker, though, let's talk about influences for a second, because obviously you're pulling from so many different places, whether it's the visual arts or the written word or even food, right? Food is a very creative outlet. I don't bake, but I can cook. And to me, they're two separate things, wildly, wildly different. And other people look at me and go, "What are you talking about? It's the same thing. You're feeding yourself." I'm like, no, totally different outlets. So, can we talk about influences for you, both just with the book, but also just you as Tessa?
Yes. But to quickly talk to your baking versus cooking point, I
Yeah,
am completely with you. I think all bakers can be cooks, not all cooks can be bakers. Because
I'm not a
baking, it's
baker.
like OCD, methodical, like the scientific chain of things that happen. You can't deviate once you begin. And cooking is very much like, oh, I'm gonna adjust this, I'm gonna do this. So I'm a cook who can bake if I
Hmm.
have to, but I am definitely not a baker. So just like raising that flag, come at me. Um yeah, but in terms of influences, I think this is where I'm a magpie and I learn from absolutely everything. And I think the fact that I've worked in so many different forms, different mediums, it shows in Feeding Ghosts because I wasn't really referencing graphic novels. And so things like mountain biking, knowing how to take a line, understanding the language of velocity. I think about that all the time. Like, how do you corner? How do you throw your body to get the momentum to get around what you need there? And so I think for me, like I'm a really kinesthetic learner, and that's where a lot of what I do comes from. But I'm also really fascinated by mediums I don't work in. So dance is one of them. And actually, the thing that back in 2014, so before I officially began this book, there's a performance arts center here in Seattle called On the Boards. And I can go there. Sometimes I'm bored out of my mind, but sometimes I see things that like fundamentally change the way that I look at the world. And so they used to have local artists write blog posts in response to their works. And they asked me if I would write one for this South African performer called Gregory Makoma. He did a piece called Exit Exist. And I wrote back and said, I'm sorry, I just can't. I'm going to a funeral the next day. I don't have time. And then I saw this piece, and it was him sort of embodying multiple generations of his ancestors. And it just broke something open in me. And so the next day on the plane, I'm headed to a funeral, and I wrote a piece called I Wasn't Going to Write This Piece. And that was the first time I ever publicly said anything about my family story. And thinking back on it, it's always been other disciplines that really inform what I do. Like the podcast Song Exploder by Rukikesh Hirway, that saved my life while in the trenches of this book because I was so burned out on words and images, but I still needed some tether that could remind me of the magic and connection of making, but it couldn't be something that I worked in. So I listened to the entire back archive of that. Yeah, I mean, I think this gives you an idea. Like when I'm trying to learn how to write a book or make a graphic novel, I'm not reading. I'm not looking at graphic novels. I'm like climbing trees. I'm taking a job working as a gardener, which is what I started to do when I finished the book. Because I think for me, it's like pattern recognition. And it works best when it's not a direct tack of what I'm looking for.
I also think the velocity of the storytelling is pretty great. I mean, again, you're covering 100 years of Chinese history. You're covering your family's history, and there are ins and outs and ups and downs and all sorts of stuff happening. The velocity of the storytelling is really important, but also really great and really satisfying. Again, I was deep in it with all of you. There was stuff that I knew, there was a lot of stuff I didn't know, and I just kept being amazed. And to me, like, I don't often get to spend all of my time in a book being surprised. And I was constantly surprised, and I really like you've done a really important thing. You've made a really important book. And I'm curious to see what's next, though. Are you thinking there might be more books? Or are you thinking maybe I'll go back to painting, or maybe I'm just going to keep building stuff with kids?
I do not think I am a creature of book length projects. I think I learned this because velocity, I think where I've arrived at the end of this process is my medium is motion. And that is the through line in everything that I do. And a book requires you to just close yourself off from the world and close yourself off from exploration for such a long time. And for better or for worse, I'm somebody where if I do something, I'm going to do it to an extreme. And I think if you're somebody who leads a more normal life within the confines of accepted society, which I definitely have not, there's this notion that like that's a part of your personality that you should dull or that it's a problem. And I think as I come out the far end of this and I'm starting to feel feisty and grounded again, I think I'm actually realizing like, nope, I was right. I am a creature of 3 to 9 month sprints where I do something all consuming and then I deeply, deeply rest and take a fallow season. So I'm definitely looking forward to getting back to a version of my life that is more like that, where I can do these all consuming, like 800% projects and then know that I'm going to be able to go to Alaska and just spend a season watching the tundra change colors to recuperate. So I don't know what I'm doing next. And it feels really good to be back in a state of unknown, but I don't think it's going to be another book.
Okay, fair enough, but I'm reserving the right to maybe change your mind.
I mean, you can try. I mean, this is where I say, like, I'm going to break publishing etiquette. And I'm just going to say, like, from the outset, I said, this is my one book. This is the one story that has chased me my entire life. And yeah, I don't know. We'll see if I come to change my mind on this, but right now I feel pretty sure.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. But, I can be patient. I'm just saying. I can be patient. This is pretty great. This is also not a book to be rushed through. And I know I just referenced the velocity of the storytelling, but this is a read a little bit, sit and think, read a little bit, sit and think, or at least it was for me, I should say. I shouldn't tell people how to read their stuff and engage with content. But Tessa Hulls, thank you so much for joining us on Poured Over. Feeding Ghosts is out now.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this conversation, roaming to some frontiers. Let's put it that way.
Everyone should be a cowboy. Everyone should be a cowboy at least once.
Until they realize, though, that that's just a myth that they're going to have to let go of because it's ultimately not helping anyone.
That's true. That's true. Well, there are books for that.
Not the ones that I'm going to write or read.
Okay, fair enough.
I'm Jenna Seery, a bookseller and associate producer of Poured Over, and today I am very excited to be joined by Griffin Hansbury, author of the new book, Some Strange Music Draws Me In. You may be familiar with some of his other work, his expansive other work, including Vanishing New York, Feral City, The Nostalgist. You have an incredibly rewarding and demanding day job. You have written all over many publications, so you are no stranger to the written word, but this new novel is something truly incredible, expansive, eye-opening, and has a lot of heart. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. It's good to be here for my first conversation about this book.
Yes, we will be uncovering things together as we go through because there is a lot here, and it definitely has settled with me more as I have been thinking about it. I think as I was first reading through, there's a lot of information, there's a lot of feelings, but it's as it sits, it's sort of coming in and being like, oh, okay, some things are starting to make sense. They're starting to find their places. But I was hoping that to start for our listeners, you could set up a little bit about the book and our characters.
Well, basically, it mostly takes place in 1984. In a small working class town in Massachusetts, where Mel is a 13-year-old kid who is, figuring out their gender identity and sexuality. And in 2019, we have Max, who is Mel once they are an adult and they've transitioned into a trans man. And Max is sort of narrating from the present, where he's gone back to this town after his mother's death to clean out the house with his sister Donna and great niece Dakota. So there's a lot in there about family and generations. And it largely takes place in 1984, but it moves back and forth. And I think the core sort of arc of the story is Mel in 1984 meets a trans woman named Sylvia, a young trans woman who sort of like comes into this town as a breath of fresh, sort of urban, exciting air, and shakes things up for everyone.
I really love the characters in this book. The voice that you give to Mel and later into Max is so easy to connect to, even though I think for many people, the exact experiences may not be something that they've gone through or something that they maybe have even thought about really in that way. And so quickly was I just like, oh, I know who this kid is. I can understand this kid. I mean, being 13, going on 14, going into high school, changing schools, friends, all that is a thing in itself that so many people probably recognize. But then to add so many other questions and struggles, it really opened so many doors to knowing that character. But when you were writing as Mel, how was finding their voice important to being able to tell this story?
It's tricky, right? Because it's narrated by Max in 2019. And so the narrator is his voice, but he's also slipping into a mind state of the past and very much about slipping into his girl experience. I put girl kind of in quotes because we have very limited language around gender and around transgender, right? And we have like these kind of words that are don't fully apply, but are the best we can do, right? So he's very much interested in excavating his girl experience and his girlhood friendships and what happened in that space. And so he's going into that voice from the past. And of course how he imagines that, right? Because memory is murky and fallible and all of that stuff. So it was a trick to kind of get into, Max has left this town. He's gone away to college. He's a teacher at an elite private high school. He's really class climbed. And so to go into the naivete of Mel was really the trick for me, is how do you kind of like step out of one's knowing oneself into a state of unknowing, which is a big theme, I think, of the book, of like, how does one know oneself when there are no models, right? What is it like to be in that darkness of not having anything available to you to tell you who you might be?
And to watch that sort of interplay between Mel as a young person and Max as someone who is more sure of himself and has some language and some capacity to understand these things and is looking back sometimes, incredulous at the past, but also with a lot of affection and care for even those who some of us would say, I can't believe that you have these tender feelings for people who have harmed you or, created unsafe environments for us. But the sort of connection between the past and present, it was very interesting. I didn't expect the two narratives right off the bat. I was excited to see that there were both because it allows for so much more depth in that character.
Yeah. And also it brings in suspense, right? To move back and forth. You're in one and you want to get back to the other, and then you're wondering what's happening in the present day. And
yeah, I was glad to see that Max was doing well. When you meet Mel at the beginning, you know that there's a lot of danger. There's a lot of things that can go wrong in that journey and for that young person. And not to say that there aren't those things, but to know, okay, Max is an adult and he's got a life and he's got, things going for him. It makes it a little bit easier to read some of those terrible moments, but at the same time, you're also like, that there's things that have to happen for one to get to the other.
So it's kind of reassuring, right, as you're going along, that
there was a lot of reassurance, but there was also like having to understand, seeing some things in Max where that it's sort of the only way into that existence is trial by fire in certain ways, that in order to get there, that there are things that have to occur.
And he's got that, I think the main sort of wound that he's still carrying is that he believes that his love is dangerous or toxic to people. So he's held it at bay, and he hasn't really had a real love relationship in his adult life. I think that would be the one piece that really is still dragging behind him.
Yeah, I think relationships in this book are so pivotal to understanding sort of many pieces of the experience. Of course, between Mel and Sylvia, this sort of older sister, younger sibling relationship, this sort of idea of seeing someone who maybe has something that you wish to inhabit for the first time. There's also Mel and their friend Jules in this complicated, friendship. Those all really sung for me as I was going through of understanding, okay, I understand these friendships.
Definitely. And I wanted to do that. I mean, I don't think I went into the book with this kind of figuring out what's going to work for readers, and that's not how I go into it, but I was glad to be able to put something together that, it's a trans narrative and it's a trans masculine narrative, which trans masculine stories generally don't elicit a lot of interest from the general public. So, you know, I think what can help this to sort of, we talk about crossing over, right? It is so much about relationships and so much, I hope, relatable relationships between, two best quote unquote girlfriends, mothers and children and siblings and older and younger friendships. And, I think so all of that is really layered in a way that I hope hopefully broadens it, you know.
I think it will help readers to understand some of the things that maybe we don't see very often in traditional media, even in sort of many queer narratives and queer stories. Like you said, the sort of trans masculine, trans man narrative is just not as well represented. And I think one of the relationships that I love the most in this book is between Max and Dakota, because Dakota's just funny, and I can just picture so many kids like them.
Yeah,
I know exactly who that is, and to watch sort of Max unfold that knowing was really fun to read.
Yeah, that like Gen Z kid who is living out in the hinterlands of America, but getting all of this information, all this gender expansiveness through the internet, through their social circles, and has this kind of, I find it's not an absence of shame. I mean, certainly, I think that there's still quite a lot of shame for young trans and queer people to work through, but they don't have the shame that I feel like my generation and previous generations had. It doesn't have the same kind of claustrophobic kind of crushingness to it. And so, yeah, so Dakota's just like, yeah, this is who I am and what's not a big deal. And they've got a piece of it figured out, because they have some kind of community, right? Which, of course, I completely lacked, and Mel Max completely lacks, Mel completely lacks in the book. And that is so crucial for people, right? To have, again, just going back to representation, like if you don't see yourself in the outside world, it's very hard to become, and the more people do see themselves, the more they do, become who they are. I mean, this is like what I think is throwing so much of sort of middle America into hysteria right now, is this idea of like, what's going on. All these trans and non-binary people are coming out of the woodwork, and I think that it's about when you multiply representation, people can imagine themselves into being.
I think so often the idea of legacy and queer elders and creating these communities and spaces. I mean, we're still talking about and recovering from a generation of lives lost to the AIDS epidemic. We're still understanding, that there are now, for the first time, people growing up who can see queer people out in the open living their lives and, creating spaces for themselves. And there are still so many dangers that these people face in their communities, especially in small towns, especially in certain areas. And yet there is connection like never before with the internet, with this ability to say, well, the community is here. And so I think that's really important for younger people to understand both the situation that they're in with this incredible community, but to also understand what has come before with the different struggles of that lack of a generation of elders.
Right, absolutely. And talking about this brings to mind the tragedy this week of Nex Benedict, right?
Absolutely.
This non-binary kid who was bullied and in the midst, and killed in the midst of this backlash against gender expansiveness. this incredible kind of constriction that we're seeing that feels so familiar, and yet in some ways not familiar, because when I was coming up, nobody thought about trans people very much. We flew under the radar, at least of the politicians. So we sort of, lived with what we had and what we could kind of cobble together. And now there's this major, attack, which trickles down. I mean, the attitudes trickle down to people's minds. I mean, a lot of this stuff, like, we're social animals, right? So feelings and thoughts are viral. We know this, and violence too can be viral.
And I think that's one thing that makes a character like Sylvia so interesting and so integral to this, because she is from a small town. She, escapes, we'll say, to a bigger city to become herself in many ways, but returns and has to struggle through what that means, but also still carries, in a way, an affection for the place she's from and the people around. It feels, I guess, as I'm reading in that way.
Interesting. Yeah, I haven't. Can you tell me more about?
I think
that?
There's something about the way that she chooses to return it all. That, even coming back to that house and those places, she had a life and could have stayed away, and yet stays. And maybe part of that affection comes from Mel and feeling some obligation or some connection there to stay. But even in the way, I mean, there's a scene at a demolition derby.
Yeah.
Where, she chooses to still engage in the community and to still go out into public and to say, yes, I'm here. Right.
She has a kind of like, I'll show them attitude, right? They're not going to keep me out, and they're not going to keep me down. Yeah, for sure.
And even the interaction she has with like the two other drivers afterwards, that's Mel's sort of unable to, it feels like Mel's unable to tell exactly how charged it is and exactly the feelings of the people involved.
Yeah, which is so true, right? I find also, like, coming from, I never know quite what class background I came from, working class, lower middle, but coming from a place like that where people don't have a lot of exposure or understanding around queerness, but there's often this tolerance, this affectionate tolerance of the queers that they know, and they will also fight for you, right? Like, it's very tribal, I suppose. If you're one of them, then you're one of them, no matter what, sort of. Although, as the book goes on, there's a moment where then Sylvia becomes not one of them in their eyes, right?
And I think that often comes sort of in this idea of small towns that are relatively close to a bigger city. There's this sort of dichotomy between, we live here and they live there. And there is some crossing back and forth. It's feasible to get to the larger cities, but, people stay where they're from. And there's sort of this idea of ideas or, culture trickling in, and that's very frightening for some people.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's a sense of, like, the city, so in this case Boston, is just like maybe 20 miles away or something. It's a 30-minute ride, which is not a big deal, and yet it could be on the other side of the moon, for this community.
I think that shows so much in this book in the presence of music. There's a lot of music references here.
Yeah.
We've got Patti Smith, we've got Michael Jackson, we've got Motley Crue, we've got sort of these hair bands, a lot of dead drummers that Jules so much loves.
Yes.
But that sort of idea of music trickling in and showing who's sort of in what class or what group based on that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, music is so powerful when you're young, right? And it can blow into your life and take you down another path. And I didn't really have that so much. Like, I didn't come to Patti Smith's music until I was probably in my 40s. I think I listened to Horses in college. A friend of mine had the record, and I didn't really like it. I didn't get it. I couldn't connect with it. I think it was too difficult for me musically. So it took a while for me to get there. And a lot of this sort of like wondering, what if I had this trans elder come into my life when I was 13? What if I had this music come into my life when I was younger? where would it have taken me? Who would I have been? What would it have changed in my life? You know, if anything at all.
I think that that's very true. And it sort of was indicative to me of, as sort of Jules and Mel sort of grow and change, it's interesting to watch them cycle through different artists and cycle in different directions. And I just remember having those things with friends where you both were like really into something, and then as you'd be like, no, this is my new music, let me show you, and they're like, no, I can't, and you're like, uh-oh, is this the sign of things to come?
Yeah, yeah, it could be the end, right? I remember I had a friend who got into heavy metal, and it was just like, who are you? I can't deal with you anymore. And of course, it wasn't the music, but it was the music as an indication that she was going in another direction of self-expression and the kinds of friendship she wanted and who she wanted to be. You know, we were going in different directions. But yeah, I mean, God, remember, I mean, when we were kids, like people would be like, "Do you like music?" Remember that question? Do you like who doesn't like music when you're 13, 14?
Right. And if someone said no, that would be the biggest red flag. If someone was like, no, I'm not really into music, I'd be like, I gotta
Right.
go.
Right, right, right. And what kind of music are you into? It would
Mhm.
say everything about you, apparently.
Yes. Yeah, the scenes of Mel and Jules sitting in the library listening
Mm-hmm.
was so, like, I remember sitting with friends, like that was like an event. If someone got like a new album or like there was something new out, and you would just sit together and listen silently. That's such a
Right,
like core
right,
crystal memory.
right, right, right. Yeah. And I wanted to sort of nail that experience too of having to listen to a whole record all the way through because that's not how we listen anymore. I mean, for the most part, right? I think maybe some people do. But you get a song, or you're on Spotify or whatever it is, and it's this sort of you can rewind, you can skip. But with a record, you had to submit to it. You had to surrender to the artist's intention and whatever sort of story they were telling through from song to song.
And it would be difficult to sometimes find new music. I mean, now, not to sound like an old, like get off my lawn kind of person, but
Mhm. Yeah.
now you can search up any music you'd like. But before, it's, maybe you'd hear it on the radio, maybe someone else would have a different tape or different whatever, something they taped off of another tape off of the radio.
Right,
Now there's
right.
so much more like accessibility, but before it was like, if you didn't hear about something, you truly may not know it existed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which I think comes to a lot of the ideas in this small town as well. Like,
hmm
they don't know about a lot of things, and as they come to understand, there's a lot of defensiveness and a lot of offensiveness of how they're going to deal with what they perceive as sort of these new ideas permeating their town.
Absolutely. Yeah. As I say, at one point, the only place in town where you could purchase reading material was at the town drugstore, where you'd get magazines basically and maybe pulp paperbacks. And that was the extent of it, And of course, we're talking about pre-internet world, right? So how does information come in? It's got to come in through somebody like Sylvia, who blows in her Trans Am with Patti Smith wailing through the windows, and that's how you got new information.
I keep coming back to this idea of writing the dual narratives between the past and I guess, the present, the 2019.
Mhm.
And I think that was very striking to me because it could have been told completely from one perspective or the other. And I wonder how that split came to be. Did you know that going in, that
Mm.
you wanted to write it in the two narratives, or did that sort of just unfold as the story needed to be told?
I think it unfolded. I wrote all of 1984 first.
Mhm.
And then I figured out how I was going to fold in 2019, you know. And why did I decide to do that? I don't really remember. But I started writing this in 2017.
Oh, so that's lifetimes ago.
Yeah.
We've lived whole
Yeah.
lifetimes since
Yeah.
then.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. But I think, wanting to kind of have this trans elder, I mean, he's 49 in the 48, 49 in the book, which in trans years is like a trans elder, right? And he transitioned in the early 90s as I did. So, but having that voice of looking back, reflecting back, a lot of it, I mean, my books are a lot about the past, nostalgia, what was there that is now gone, what has been erased, what has been removed, what do we forget, what do we remember? And so to have this voice of somebody who's remembering, I think was really important to me.
I really enjoyed the 2019 Max perspective, because I felt so often that Max was speaking directly at me in a way that I really enjoyed. I think so often there are these narratives of people being like, well, you know, for queer authors or other marginalized authors, everything feels like autofiction. Everything must be exactly the author's experience because people can't imagine that someone would be able to write something that isn't their own. But there does feel like a lot of soul in this book and a lot of deep feelings, especially in the Max perspective, because Max is going through his own sort of struggles with identity in a way that I think we don't see very often portrayed in media. When we're talking about trans stories, so often it is about the point of transition, and not about the continuing life of that person.
Right.
And whether there may be, you know, great successes and joys of living authentically and living as that individual, but also that there are continuing struggles that are ongoing and changing. That identity does not, when you transition, your identity is not, okay, here it is what it is now.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And I did not want to write a transition story, right? That's the story that I think the, media, which is run by mostly cis people, right? That's like what the cis gaze, GAZE, not GAYS, is hungry for. At this point in my life, I'm not so interested in the transition story. It's so far into my past personally. So I wanted something that was also about like how one's self-concept really changes over time through just living as trans and living in the world as a person.
I think there will be a lot of people that are glad for those stories. I think a lot of young people, especially, that are still looking for that community and that knowledge, will be glad to say, oh, here's something. And something I was saying earlier is that this book has a lot of balance in its tone, that there are moments of joy along with the moments of heartbreak. There are moments where Mel and Max experience happiness and, these great things in their lives, these successes, these days. I think so much about the day where Sylvia takes Mel to get a haircut and some new clothes and on this adventure. And it's such a sigh of relief and a moment in the novel that are really needed to balance that story that can be incredibly challenging to read.
I'm hearing this from people that there's this challenging quality to this that, like, tell me if you felt this way, that a feeling of like, oh, what's going to happen to these characters that I care about, right? And this nervousness around that. Did you feel that while you were reading?
I think there are parts towards the end where you can sort of see something looming, where oh, something is going to happen, that there's no way sort of out of where we are without a catalyst, without some big things that have to happen. And it doesn't feel like overwhelming or unwarranted because the setup allows us to know where we've been and where it's going to go. But it's added with enough like heart and care that it doesn't feel overwhelming, I should say.
Okay. Well, that's good to hear.
And I think especially because that's how life is. You have these huge, awful, sometimes heartbreaking moments, but they can be very closely linked to wonderful, lovely times as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I wonder, does it feel very different to write a fiction piece, a novel, versus your nonfiction that you've put out in the past?
It does. I started out in life as a poet, and then I started writing fiction probably around 2001, 2002, and The Nostalgist was the first novel that I published with a very small press, kind of came and went. I don't think many people read that book at all. So it almost feels like it doesn't count. And then I wrote probably like another 7 novels, and could not get them published. A lot of rejection from agents and editors, and just a lot of rejection. And then, I started the blog Vanishing New York in 2007, mostly for myself, just to have a place to write about things that I cared about, specifically around New York and gentrification. The blog just kind of took off. It was successful in a way that my novels weren't. And then people wanted me to write the book Vanishing New York. And I didn't really want to, sort of like, well, what about my novels? Don't you want my novels? And the answer was no, we don't want your novels. Sorry. We want this nonfiction. So I did that. And I finally got an agent for Some Strange Music. And we sent it out in early March of 2020. And that was a bad time to be sending out a novel.
Yes, just a few small things happening at the time.
Yeah. So it didn't happen. Once again, I thought this is never going to happen for me. I'm not gonna be able to have my novelist experience come true. And then, I wrote Feral City and loved writing Feral City and got that sold to Norton. And then on the back of that, I was able to sell my novel to the same editor at Norton. And so that's how I got here. I mean, this is this is life, right? You're like, this is the path I want, and then life says no. This is the path you're going to be on, and it's going to go like this, and it's going to go this way and that way, and it's not going to be what you expect, and it's definitely not going to be what you plan. And if you're really, really lucky and you keep pushing and pushing and pushing and facing, I mean, it's a miserable I'm 52 years old. It took me a long time to get to have this book out into the world. And there was a lot of, I mean, I have a pile of novels that are just collecting dust, and they're probably not great, and that's okay. And I learned something from writing them all. And it's also heartbreaking to know that they're just what they are and they'll never have life. But, you know, if you're very lucky and you keep pushing, maybe this will happen. So, in terms of like the difference between the writing, I mean, in some ways, I resented my nonfiction because it's all anybody wanted from me. I also have published a lot as a psychoanalyst in psychoanalytic journals, and that was also somewhat easy. It's what people wanted from me. And nobody wanted my fiction, is how it felt. So hopefully people will want this one.
I think as a reader, I mean, it's hard to know. The world is, the world of reviews and all that is crazy, but
Sure.
There is something truly special about this book that, as I was going through, can imagine really touching the lives of a lot of people. I think it's an important thing to have out there, this voice, this story. And so I'm excited to see the response and to see the people that are gravitating towards it. It kind of leads me into something I like to ask is, who do you hope finds this book? Is there a reader that you can imagine where if they walk into a bookstore and find it on the table that you'd be like, this is for you?
I think, in some ways, everybody who's represented in the book, right? So there's the young person who is queer, trans, non-binary, figuring it out, who I want to have find this book. There's the middle-aged trans guy who's been through the mill of life and like had an experience of not being seen or heard, and I want him to find the book. I want trans women like Sylvia. I mean, one of the things I love about Sylvia is that she's a tomboy trans woman, which I also don't think really gets depicted a whole lot. I love that about her. And so I want to see people see themselves in her. And then, there's a lot of like conservative people in the book too. And I want them to find it. And I want them to see the humanity and relatability of the queer folks that are in this book. So I don't know, is that everybody on the planet? Not quite.
I mean, maybe not quite everybody, but maybe all
Yeah.
the people that I think often look for themselves in literature and maybe aren't always able to find something that feels authentic and right. But I do think that they'll find it here with this book. So I am very excited for people to get their hands on Some Strange Music Draws Me In. It is an incredible story that I think will connect to any reader. So thank you so much for being here with us today and for talking about your book.
Thank you. This was a real pleasure. Appreciate all of your curiosity and thoughtfulness about it.
Hello, readers. It's time for another TBR Topoff. We're going to recommend a couple of fantastic books to go along with today's wonderful double shot episode. I'm Marc, coming to you from my Barnes & Noble in Cincinnati, and we're going to kick things off with my book buddy Mary in Beaumont, Texas. Hi, Mary.
Hi, Marc. So when thinking about today's double shot and the books that we are doing today, Hungry Ghosts was the one that I picked. So I was thinking about Feeding Ghosts and the Strong Women and Families. And so my pick is Persepolis by Marjan Sharapi. It's autobiographical, and it's about Marjan growing up during the Iranian Revolution in the late 70s. And it's got humor and it's got horror because this is coming from, the eyes of a child. And, it has powerful imagery, and you understand how families had to hold on to each other and how powerful just one simple action was. It opens your eyes to the part of the world you may not know, a part of a history you don't know. So definitely worth a read. There's 2 volumes of this. It also had a short animated film, and it was wonderful. I know you and I both liked it so very much. So my pick for TBR Topoff is Persepolis by Marjan Sharapi.
Love it. It's so good. I think there's a reason that it is a required school read in many schools across the country. It's so excellent. Nice choice. So I have the pleasure of recommending a book for Some Strange Music Draws Me In. I am very excited to read this book. I've been kind of hungry for it for a while, so I'm very, very stoked to dive in. And it just made me think about the waves of contemporary queer and trans novels that have been published over the past few years. So thinking about a recommendation and having such a beautiful wealth of titles to choose from just feels like a wonderful gift. So it led me to a novel that came out a few years ago called The Seep by Chana Porter. This is a speculative fiction book that really floored me. It is about a kind of gentle but very profound shift in society to a full utopia, all due to an alien invasion, bear with me, that really essentially makes the world better in almost every aspect. We follow specifically our heroine Trina, who is a middle-aged trans woman, and she is feeling really good about the changes that are being made. She and her wife Diba are maybe not embracing with open arms, because alien invasion, there's a lot to take in, but these profound and beautiful shifts in the world improving overnight, essentially, it's hard to deny. So basically how it works is almost anything imagined can be actualized and achieved because we want it to, really based off of this alien technology that gets introduced. So you think about capitalism, you think about class, you think about economy wars, all of that fades away because we want it to go away. It's miraculous, and it makes it nearly perfect. And I say nearly because Diba's imagination pulls her away from Trina in an irrevocable way. Trina is now alone due to a decision that Diba makes. And Trina decides to journey out to not only come to terms with the world as it is now, but more importantly, come to terms with her loss and her broken heart and this void that she really hasn't been ready to face. The book is lovely. It's about the other in numerous ways. It's about possibility. It's about loss and love and so much life. I really love the book. So check out The Seep by Chana Porter. But that's all we have for today. Thanks so much for tuning in to Pour It Over, and please make sure to give us a rating and subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can also follow us on our socials at Barnes & Noble. I'm Mark. You can follow my home store at BN Westchester. And Mary, where can we find you?
You can follow us at BN Beaumont TX.
Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Happy reading. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. Pour It Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.